Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this AD54 Candidate Forum, sponsored by grassroots groups Sunrise Movement LA, Healthcare for All Los Angeles, Americans for Democratic Action, Southern California chapter, and independent media group Knock LA. The candidates that we will hear from tonight are Isaac Bryan, Samuel Morales, and Dallas Fowler. I just like to add before we get started, I am personally not endorsing in this race, but I do think it's incredibly important that as many people as possible hear from the candidates directly and have a chance, as many chances as possible to make up their mind. So I was incredibly happy that all of the groups listed before agreed to move forward with this candidate forum. I think you're going to learn a lot that will inform your vote. Just a side note to say that we did invite Cheryl Turner, Heather Hutt, and Bernard Center. They are not here, but they were invited. So you'll have more time with the three candidates I mentioned before. So we have enough time to move forward. I'll just say my name is Daniel Lee, currently vice mayor here in Culver City, former candidate for SD30. What you came here is to hear from the candidates. They will each have 90 seconds for an intro. And we'll start with Isaac Bryan. Mr. Bryan.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you everybody who's tuning in. I think the more times we have to engage each other, even virtually, the more important it is. Special elections, especially after special elections, tend to go under the radar. But I think the 54th is a special district and won't allow this to go under the radar. My name is Isaac Bryan. I'm running for this seat for a mixture of personal and professional reasons. Me and 8 of my siblings were adopted out of the child welfare system as kids. I've been to 11 different public schools. If you count the 2 universities, 3 high schools. Middle school, I failed out of 2 community colleges, but by the time I made to UCLA for my master's in public policy, I realized I was the only one of my adopted siblings to make it to college. Many didn't graduate high school. All of my siblings left in California are incarcerated or houseless right now. So running for this seat is a very critical time in California. It's a time when we need bold leadership. It's a time where a global pandemic has exacerbated the social inequities we already knew were in society. And simultaneously, it's a time when we have a surplus of resources in Sacramento. We need our champions to bring those resources home. We need to lay the framework for rebuilding and transforming our communities in a way that includes everybody, especially those who have been historically failed by policy. So I'm glad to be here today, and I'm looking forward to all the questions.
Thank you for that, Isaac. Dallas Fowler. Ms. Fowler.
Greetings, Sunrise, Los Angeles, Healthcare for All, ADA SoCal, all of the partners, everyone who is participating here with us on Twitch this afternoon. I am honored to be before you to tell my story. I am a lifelong resident and I grew up in and around this district my entire life. I have been the victim of environmental racism, like many folks in our communities. The drilling happening in and around the 54th Assembly District in particular is one of the driving forces that drives me to make this run and ask to be your representative in the 54th. We have contaminated water wells throughout this state. We have efforts to privatize our water throughout this county, and we have to send someone to the legislature who is committed to bringing solutions and stopping the drilling and fracking happening in our communities and shifting California's ecology. I am committed to doing that. My background has been in both the public and private sector. I worked in construction, financial services, which is why I support a public bank. I've also worked in arts and media entertainment. I'm doing the work right now to ensure that we have jobs for the future. The future of work is changing. There are a number of dynamics in technology as it relates to what we can be doing with our trash and how we can be building a more safer, sustainable economy and funding a Green Deal in California to bring 500,000 thriving wage jobs to fix our ecology. I am committed to doing that work, and I am grateful to be here with you today. So thanks again, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that. Mr. Morales.
Hello, Sunrise LA. My name is Samuel Morales. I am a third generation Californian on my father's side, second generation on my mother's side. My father was a US Army military policeman. My mother was a waitress her whole career, and she was a union steward. I come from working class roots. I worked real hard in high school, made it to Vassar College. The reason I tell you this is because I understand how important education is, how it could really change the trajectory of your life. My three main issues are low income and affordable housing. I've lived in District 54 since 2009. I live in West Adams, yes. And I think it's also very important, healthcare for all. I believe healthcare is a human right, no doubt about it. I think my approach may be a little different, but I want to make it clear from the get-go, healthcare is a human right. So I've seen that housing in our district is out of control. I see it on a daily basis. So just to be clear, my three main objectives where I be elected would be low income and affordable housing, healthcare for all. My approach is Medicare for all, or Medicare for those who want it. Then, of course, we have to support LAUSD and the teachers union to bring our educational system up to standards. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for your answers. I am going to be letting you know both in the chat and audibly when you have 30 seconds and 15 seconds. If I feel like the chat isn't working, even though I'm trying to be inobtrusive, then I'll just start saying it out loud. The first section of questions concerns law enforcement, police, and sheriffs. It's an issue I know a lot of you are incredibly passionate about. And after I make my initial question, we will be hearing from journalist Cerise Castle ask a few questions in the context of an incredibly riveting and pretty much not to be missed series that she has recently done on sheriffs and the gangs in our Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. Before we get to that, I wanted to take moderator's privilege and ask you a question that's very near and dear to my heart. Of course, I've been in jail for justice quite a few times, but what you might not know about me is that the first and only time that I met my father was when I was 9 and he was in a military prison. I've also had my older brother, 2 cousins, and various uncles involved in the carceral system, most of them for 10 years or more in federal prison. While I hear a lot of talk about alternatives to incarceration, one of the things that I talked about in my race is alternatives to interaction, alternatives to even being seen by a police officer, particularly if you're a young person of color. So for, unfortunately, 30 seconds, I might have you go up to 1 minute. Can you please let me know any ideas that you may have around preventing interactions with law enforcement rather than different types of punishment? And since we started with Mr. Bryan before, we'll start with you, Ms. Fowler, right now.
Okay. Thank you so much for this question. I too have been I have not been spared by the war on drugs and by the over-policing in and around our communities. Growing up in South Los Angeles, my first cousin is struck out. He had his 3rd strike and he will not be coming out of jail. He is serving a life sentence, a natural life sentence. And when I think about the issues as it relates to how he got there, just being around the wrong crowd at the wrong time, enhancements, put a mandatory minimum sentence on him right away as a 19-year-old. And then subsequently from there, he never learned how to function fully living outside of the prison system. And so he was wanting to go back because it was so hard. The conditions were so hard for him to be able to get a job, to be able to engage. And so I will just say this. We have to address the poverty in and around our neighborhoods. As Nelson Mandela said, poverty is crime. We know in working with the mayor of Los Angeles, the more recreation, arts, after school programming, things that we have for our kids and our communities, the less the crime. The crime is reduced 35 to some cases 55% in and around our parks and in our neighborhoods. Also ensuring that...
Please bring it to a close, Ms. Fowler.
Okay, well, I'll just say what I am working on. I am working on a entertainment arts program to go into our LA County jail system, because we know that the juveniles have been moved into our county jail system. And there's not enough time for me to talk about this, I'm sorry, but I do have ideas around how we reduce those interactions in community safety policing. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Fowler. Mr. Morales.
As I said from the outset, education is fundamental. I believe that LAUSD and the teachers union is failing our students. If we can work with LAUSD and the teachers union, I believe that we can work with the police and the police union and helping them reimagine policing in this country. Now, obviously, we're speaking specifically about California. So it's going to be a challenge. I think it's obvious to anyone who's paying attention that policing in this country has a lot of work to do. But my approach, just like with LAUSD, who arguably is failing our children, is to work within the existing framework and move towards, as Daniel said, non-carceral options.
Thank you for that, Mr. Morales. Mr. Bryan.
Yeah, to answer your question more directly, yes, I've been organizing around this issue for a long time. I sit on the executive board of Justice LA. I've been endorsed by Patrice Cullors and Melina Abdullah, and I wrote the city's first reentry report. But your question was about how to interact frontline encounters to begin with. And that's why we need alternative crisis response models, right? And people first language always. It's youth, it's not juveniles. Alternative crisis response means that if we don't need a badge and a gun, which is for almost everything, then we need alternative responders. We need intervention workers. We need public health workers. We need social safety workers. And for youth, we built out a youth diversion and development model for LA County. I was a big part of that laid out community-based organizations that young people get taken to instead of booked by the LAPD. The problem is the LAPD are still the ones taking them to these sites. And so we need to get those crisis response alternatives in place. So it's not law enforcement getting them connected with diversion services. It's community getting them connected with diversion services. So we've laid step one. We've got to lay step two. We used to have a youth reinvestment fund at the state level. It was one-time money. We need to bring that back and make it sustainable.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bryan. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Cerise Castle, who, as I mentioned, did a series on sheriffs and gangs, amongst other journalistic work, and she has a number of questions for the candidates. Cerise?
Thank you. My first question is this. Sheriff's deputies are not like you and me, literally. They are afforded a generous set of legal protections not extended to anybody in this room. The Public Safety Officers Procedural Bill of Rights Act guarantees that police officers can review evidence and meet with a union representative before they answer an investigator's questions. Qualified immunity protects law enforcement from being responsible for paying damages to the families of people they have harmed out of their own pocket. Officers are allowed to remain working after they have killed someone. Bills to change this have failed time and time again in the state legislature. Several are currently making their way through the houses. If you are elected, would you support legislation to roll back special privileges for law enforcement? And how will you ensure that it is passed and signed by the governor? I'll give that to Mr. Morales.
Is this a 90-second response?
This is actually a 2-minute response.
Yeah, qualified immunity is a tough one, right? So if an officer harms someone, he can't be sued and held personally liable. Now let's think about that. Why would that be in place? Let's use an analogy. I'm in financial services. I've been in financial services for 16 years. I'm a stockbroker. If I make a fat finger mistake and I buy 1,000 shares of something as opposed to 100 shares, And
Mr. Morales, my question was if you would support legislation and how would you ensure that it passed, not explaining what qualified immunity is.
I support qualified immunity, because think about it. Let's say Derek Chauvin hopefully is found guilty and is punished. Should his wife and children be ruined? Think about that. Yeah, what he did was wrong. I think even a blind man could see that. So if he's sued, he'll be in prison, right? If he's sued, what, his house, his pension, all of his assets should be stripped of him. What of his family? What of his children? So yeah, perhaps, yeah, his life should be ruined. He took a life. I don't think anyone's arguing that. But again, what qualified immunity is being able to sue someone so they're personally, financially liable. I don't think it would be right for his wife and children to be.
30 seconds.
So there's my answer on qualified immunity. I would not support legislation getting rid of qualified immunity for the reasons I just enumerated.
Thank you for that, Mr. Morales. And as much as possible, please try to directly answer the question that is asked. Our questioners, me as your moderator, and specifically the voters will definitely appreciate that. Excuse me, Cerise, go on.
Yeah, I'll kick it to Ms. Fowler.
Okay, so yes, I do support ending qualified immunity. I'm proud of New Mexico and some of the other states that are taking this up. I support Senator Bradford's bill. I support revisioning the Bill of Rights for police officers. I do not think you get to investigate and review all of the evidence before you are even questioned about what happened that night. That is a part of the collection of evidence. And I believe in consequences. That's the only way we stop this culture. And in terms of the gang culture that is happening within our LA County Sheriff system, I do not support it. And I have tried to put my ear to the ground as much as possible to hear about other activities that are happening. There are a number of homicides that have happened as it relates to not just our LA County Sheriffs, our CHP officers, and our LAPD. And if we don't have real civil consequences as well as incarceral consequences as it relates to these murders and these brutal beatings, then we don't have a real serious rule of law that says no man or individual or woman is above the law. And we have too many instances of that. So yes, I support ending qualified immunity and all of these other actions that amendments are part of the Bill of Rights that no regular ordinary citizen would have those advantages. So that is my answer. But also historically, I have supported and I've pushed back on some of our other members of our Board of Supervisors who thought it was okay to continue doing study after study on body cameras when we had a number of homicides at the hands of our sheriffs that were not being documented. I do believe that body cameras can make a difference in some cases. It may not be every single case, but we needed them. LAPD had their body cameras, which I also fought for them to get their body cameras back in 2014, 2015, whenever that was. And here we are 5 years later, still having to organize in 2020 to get the LA Board of Supervisors to provide and fund body cameras for our sheriffs. So I'm willing to do that work, and I'm also willing to stand up in our legislature and talk and have all of the difficult conversations that are necessary to get that bill to the governor's desk, and including leaning on our governor to get him to sign it.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan?
Yeah, absolutely. First thing I want to say is I think Hamid Khan, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, my brother Pete White would have some grave concerns about the expansion of police surveillance, including body cameras that bloat police budgets at a time when we're questioning that kind of resource allocation. And the state legislature, I would, of course, push for the decertification bill, the Kenneth Ross Jr. bill put up by Stephen Bradford. It should have made it last year. The only reason it didn't make it last year is because we didn't have the right champions in the assembly to get it off the assembly floor. Also, Assemblymember Holden's bill to hold partners accountable for when they're when their other partner has misconduct. I think we also had a huge problem with the Victims Compensation Fund for the longest time, where it was a tool for prosecutors. Instead of considering police violence as victims as well, you could have women who were raped by COs who still couldn't access resources from the state's Victim Compensation Fund. We've been looking at that for about a year now. We still need to get those resources down to community. There's a lot of work we've got to do. I've been working with the Check the Sheriff Coalition for a very, very long time. I've been working with a lot of folks here locally to get these things off the ground. I'm thinking of John Horton. I'm thinking of his mother, Helen Jones, right now. This is work that requires multi-level collaboration. You're going to need actors in the county to move some of these resources. The county operates the jails and the sheriff's department, but the state can lay that framework. It's the state that helped build out the framework for oversight based off of Measure R, led by Patrice Cullors here in Los Angeles, for the rest of the state to have those subpoena powers, to have the ability to question and to have the ability to check the sheriff in a very meaningful way. We've also been looking locally about the idea of an appointed sheriff versus an elected sheriff. I don't know how much leg room that kind of look has, but I'm glad that we're taking that kind of bold action, because what we're seeing right now is an oppressive regime far and away worse than what we've ever seen before, knowing that this institution was designed to be hostile for specific communities, and especially Black, brown, poor, and indigenous communities.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. My next question is this. My reporting confirmed 18 deputy gangs in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. This week, the Mercury News confirmed that there is at least one deputy gang operating within the Vallejo Police Department. The deputy gang problem does not appear to be isolated to Los Angeles and may be affecting citizens across the state. Would you support firing law enforcement employees who are members of these gangs? I'll give that to Ms. Fowler.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll go next to Mr. Morales.
Yes, that's a resounding yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Bryan?
Absolutely. And we should go a step further. They've kept a database on our communities for countless years. They put us in the gang database just because of where we lived or who we're related to or who we were seen on the street corner next to, what we're wearing, and all other kinds of crazy symbols. When we know that there are sheriffs engaged and police officers engaged in this kind of gang activity, the state needs to have a statewide database. It needs to correspond with the decertification process. It's not just firing. You should have no job in law enforcement ever again.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. And I would just like to point the voters to the NOC LA gang database that is constructed, which contains all of the deputies that we have found to be associated or members of deputy gangs in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. My next question is this. There is currently a bill proposing background checks for potential law enforcement officers, which would disqualify people belonging to certain hate groups. Would you support this legislation, Mr. Bryan?
Absolutely. We need a holistic reevaluation on what kind of a background we need to look for our law enforcement officers. I'm questioning the size and scope or the need for any new officers to begin with. But even in that process, we've got to look even deeper, because there are a lot of character attributes that we need to weed out, like those who view the community and law enforcement interactions as a wartime setting, former military officers, et cetera. There are things that exacerbate the root problems, and belonging to a hate group is more than an easy one to root out.
Thank you. Ms. Fowler?
Yes, and just to go back to the other question, even with the George Floyd bill that is put up in Congress, I lobbied Karen Bass's office as a number of Congressional Black Caucus members to include what I called a Floyd's list of officers who are killer cops who are in our communities. When I talk to young men in and around our communities, they want to know if there is someone who has a history of targeting them, just like women want to know, or other victims want to know, if there is a sexual assault person who's committed crimes against women. They want to know that same information. And so, yes, I agree with taking it a step further and having an active database that they can not only be no longer hired again, but that members of the community know where they are.
Thank you, Ms. Fowler. And finally, Mr. Morales?
Yes, I would 100% support background checks on police officers. And if they have been a member of a hate group, that should disqualify them, full stop. So many professions, mine included in financial services, have background checks. I have a 10-finger, fingerprint check and a total background check. So of course, if a police officer has been associated with hate groups, that should 100% disqualify him from being hired. And I agree with Isaac. That person should have no business in law enforcement whatsoever. It just shows such an obvious bias from the get-go. Yeah, 100% support background checks for law enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Morales. And here's my final question for the candidates. Currently, California law requires that anyone running for sheriff for a county is a Let me start that over. Currently, California law requires that anyone running for sheriff of a county is a law enforcement officer. Senator Scott Wiener recently introduced a bill that allows any registered voter to run for sheriff. Would you support this legislation? I'll start off with Mr. Morales.
So, I'm sorry, the question is, should any registered voter be able to run for sheriff?
Yes, this is something that's been proposed by Senator Wiener. It is a bill that is currently working its way through the legislation.
Well, yeah, anyone should be able to run for sheriff. I don't see why not, unless of course there's something in their background, like being a member of like the Proud Boys or some hate group. Why not? I feel like I might be missing something in your question.
Oh no, that was my question.
Yeah, I believe anyone should be able to run for sheriff. Pending
Thank you.
Background check.
Thank you, Mr. Morales. Next, I'll go to Mr. Bryan.
No, absolutely. I like the idea of the bill, but the reality is it's going to take a lot more than that, right? We know that this is a massive institution, and just changing the head of it doesn't change its primary function in society. Like the district attorney, the sheriff's department is inherently adverse and adversarial to community. Even in LA County, where we have a progressive district attorney, but he's a career law enforcement officer and a historic district attorney, the institution of the DA's office is still rebutting, rebuking, and pushing back on his election. And so the idea that anyone can run for sheriff, I think, is a good idea. But in practice, we've got to do so much more to curtail the way that this institution can continue to exacerbate harm in our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Ms. Fowler?
Yes, if someone wants to run for sheriff, I think Mr. Morales mentioned a background check. There, unfortunately, are no background checks actually ran on candidates when they run for office. So that would be something that would be completely different than what has historically taken place. But I'll say this, since this is your last question, Cerise, there are only 2 counties in this state where the coroner reports to the sheriff. That is Yolo County and Los Angeles County. We need to change that. I'm committed to doing that. The coroner should be accountable to the people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Daniel, I think you're on mute.
And thank you, Cerise, for all of your questions, and thank all of the candidates for your responses. Might have to talk to some of you about those offline later, but I really appreciate you putting the thought into that. Our next section is on charter schools and public education. And I'm just going to say a little bit about my background in charter schools and then pass it over to Yasmin Pomeroy, who's a candidate for LA City Council, but also a union teacher at a charter school within the Los Angeles area. I must admit, when I was getting my master's at UCLA, my final project really focused on charter schools in particular and the potential harm that they've done. At least that was my intent. It ended up being a documentary around education and segregation. And a lot of my research found that charter schools in particular actually exacerbate segregation when it comes to education. I had the privilege of a very good public education that was all public, but was public magnet and public international baccalaureate. But I think sometimes there is a push from charter school lobbies to conflate the notion of charter schools with magnet schools. And I think that's potentially harmful to students and families. With that said, I'm going to shut up and pass it over to Yasmin Pomeroy to ask the candidates the next round of questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that introduction. As he mentioned, my name is Yasmin Pomeroy. I am a charter school educator. I am also part of UTLA and a candidate for Los Angeles City Council in District 3. My first question is, how should the state deal with currently existing charter schools?
And who would you like to answer that first, Yasmin?
Let's go with Mr. Bryan first.
A moratorium on any new ones and question the efficacy of those that already exist. We had greater transparency and accountability measures put in a couple years ago. Thank goodness it took way too long. We know that charter schools are divesting resources that could belong in our public education, even just as little as not owning the land that they're built on and having taxpayer dollars pay the mortgage for staying on that land. I myself, I've been to 11 different public schools. If you count the 2 universities, 2 community colleges, 3 high schools, middle school, and several elementary schools. We know that there is a per pupil spending that's less in California than almost everywhere else in the country. We have to do more. We have to invest in more. And charter schools that siphon out the most brilliant among us and consolate them in a congregated way and then blame other schools for failing, it's dishonest and disingenuous. At the same time, we all want our kids to do better. We all want to close achievement gaps. And the way to do that is to invest resources that make all of our schools high performing, that make all of our children feel like they belong to an elite institution and not just pulling out a select few.
Thank you so much. Ms. Fowler?
Well, kudos to Mr. Bryan on that response. I would echo all of his sentiments. I believe that the charters that are still in existence should be definitely held to the same standards. We are not seeing record test scores or any record achievement as it relates to the charters. So I do have a strong question as to whether or not they are fully being held to those same standards, one, but they are fully achieving the goals that they set out to. I support a full moratorium. I think particularly here in Los Angeles County, the head of the Board of Education, Alex Johnson, who was supporting my opponent's campaign, Mr. Bryan, he has been running charter schools through Los Angeles County like water. Okay, even when charter institutions and charter compliance organizations say that they should not be chartered. So I am not taking money from charter proponents of charter. I am not taking money from charter organizations because I am committed to this work. I am highly committed to public education. All of these children are ours, and we need to ensure that they are getting the quality, access, and equity in access to education that they deserve. So no matter where you are at a charter school, or be it a public education, I will be working to ensure that we are increasing per pupil spending and you are getting the things that you need. I am committed to financial literacy because that is the only way that we can close the wealth gap in California and throughout this country. And so I would legislate a mandate for a curriculum around financial literacy, starting at the middle school, high school level and up. That is the only way we truly close the wealth gap and make sure that this next generation is not going to be squeezed into a workforce with 5 other generations of people, and make sure that they have a retirement with dignity and death with dignity in the communities that they grew up in and served. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for your answer. Mr. Morales?
Yes, well, LA County, the city of Los Angeles, is approximately 50% white. If you look at LAUSD, 9% white. What's up with that? Why are parents so desperate for an alternative to LAUSD? Because LAUSD is failing our students. Where I live here in West Adams Mid-City, I repeat, all of the public schools are underperforming. Now, my middle class and upper middle class neighbors sending their children to LAUSD, be it Dorsey High, be it Virginia Road Elementary, it is a non-starter, okay? They're not going to send their children to underperforming, failing schools. Why are parents so desperate for an alternative to LAUSD? Is because the education they're receiving, it's not up to snuff. Now, the class sizes are way too large. 43 students in a class, that's just preposterous. There are not enough counselors. So we need to work with LAUSD and the teachers union to get them the resources they need. There's no question about that. Work within the existing framework. But why are charter schools even an issue? It goes to the fact that the schools are not performing. So we need to look at why we're even having a conversation about charter schools. It's because LAUSD just isn't performing where they need to be. So I know it's a tough one. Perhaps we should put a moratorium on charter schools for now, put a pause, because as my colleagues have said, charter schools are siphoning away resources from LAUSD, which is already grossly underfunded. But we need to look at the root of the issue. And charter schools exist because parents are desperate to get their children into a school.
And time, Mr. Morales.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My next question has to do with unionization. There's this misconception that charter educators are not unionized and they do not want to be part of a union, which is wildly untrue. So my next question, and I will direct this starting with Mr. Morales, how will you assist charter educators in unionizing?
How will I assist? Didn't you just say that they already are a part of the union?
Not all of them. So there's a handful of charter schools, mostly charter conversions, that have stepped away from LAUSD, who were able to unionize because it was an easier process. But many standalone charters are not part of a union. So there's a misconception that we don't want to be part of a union, that we don't want to unionize, when realistically we do want to be part of a union. So
well, I'm pro-union. I come from a union household. I've said repeatedly about working with the teachers union to help LAUSD come up to standards. So I'm union all the way, which includes the police union, right? So if you're pro-labor, you're pro-labor. And I am pro-labor. The police union is a union. The teachers union is a union. I support unions. If charter school teachers want to join a union, I say more power to them. I don't see why we would put any roadblocks in front of them to join the union. Unions are a vital part of working people's lives, and I fully support all unions.
Thank you for your response. Mr. Bryan, I would love to hear from you.
I have so many thoughts. First, no, police unions are not the same as all other unions. Second, Samuel Morales just criticized the teachers union just a few minutes ago in his first answer. I think the idea of charter educators unionizing is a conversation we need to have with UTLA and the California Teachers Association. I've been endorsed by the California Teachers Association and the California School Employees Association, and I'm happy to help broker that conversation and build that table so we can see this from all issues. I would also like to point out that Alex Johnson is a stand-up member of our community, is a former director of the Children's Defense Fund and California Safety for Justice. You can disagree with somebody on an issue and still build coalition with them. It's the same way that Dallas Fowler could talk about police reform while being supported by three-time police chief Mayor Butts. It's okay to carry relationships and disagree with folks. That's how we build healthy conversation. You don't compromise your values. You push everybody to a common shared interest. And we're not always going to agree on everything, but we don't demonize stand-up folks in our community, Alex Johnson included.
No one demonized Alex Johnson. If you took it as that, that would be your personal opinion. I am friends with Alex. I have a lot of love for him. God bless him, his wife, and his children. However, we don't agree on the issue as it relates to charter. And there are a number of institutions that he has approved through the County Board of Education that have not been approved through other charter compliance organizations. And that's just a fact. He is a huge proponent of charter. So he's raising money for you. If you go around and you say that you're not taking money for charter, but you've got Austin Butner, Nick Melvoin, and all of the major proponents of charter schools raising money for your campaign. So we're just going to be honest here about what it is. Yes, I have a relationship with James Butts, who was the mayor of Inglewood, and my work with him only began, excuse me, I'm talking, through his work and time as with the city of Inglewood. Now, as it relates to your question, I have been approached by charter organizations to serve on their board, and I would not serve on their board unless they would come to the table with UTLA and be willing to discuss allowing their workers, teachers, faculty to be able to be a part of UTLA and unionize. I will always support workers' rights to organize. That has to happen. But when we get into who's taking money from who and which organizations, that means we have to do the work in our state legislature to take all of the special interest money out of politics and ensure that we have publicly financed campaigns, which is why I have been a longtime supporter of Trent Lang and the California Clean Money Act to make sure that we are doing all of the proper disclosures. But let's do the real work, since Democrats have had a majority here and we have agreed that we want the money out of politics. Let's do the real work to ensure that we have publicly financed campaigns. But back to your original question, I will always support workers' rights to organize, and I have been making those efforts to ensure that the members of charter organizations come under union representation. Thank you.
Thank you all for all of your responses in this section, and thank you, Yasmin, for your questions. We'd like to move on. We definitely encourage robust debate, but we want to be true to our word and trying to get you out as soon as possible and covering the subject matter areas that we want to. I hope that there will be more opportunities down the road for us to get into the specifics. And while I think it's completely above board for us to point out things that are happening in other campaigns, our real focus is trying to get your opinions about what's happening in terms of policy out to people. Your criticisms of other candidates are welcome, but please try to weight your responses towards the answers to the questions. The next section is going to be fairly brief. This is something that I'm sort of passionate about, and I'm just very curious about. One of the things that I talked about in my campaign recently is that the potential benefit of having both universal preschool and universal childcare that could be provided by the state of California. In my interactions with people in Culver City, around the 30th district, around Los Angeles County, very generally, I've met a number of parents who've told me that their largest expense is not their rent or their mortgage, it's childcare. And on the other hand, they're afraid that their children won't have the same opportunities as children in more affluent families because they don't have the means or resources to provide as much when it comes to early education. So very briefly, in a minute, if you can, please tell me your opinion both on universal preschool and universal childcare. And let's start with Mr. Bryan, then Ms. Fowler, and then Mr. Morales.
Absolutely a fan of both universal childcare and universal preschool. And we need to fund it at a state level. And the way that we get these resources, we've got the wealth tax already in conversation. We can also look at ACA 1, but we can also look at the amount that we're spending on corrections expenditures. In LAUSD, for example, we were spending $70 million a year just on our school police force. We took 25 million of that, those of us who organized in the streets and fought for it and wanted it this last year, but there's still another 50 million on the table. That's money that can go towards things like universal pre-K. Obviously, that won't cover a district as large as LAUSD that has 600,000 students currently, but the state needs to kick in, the county needs to kick in. We need to look at this for the way that it is. We know that this last year, COVID-19 exacerbated the inequities in our society. We found out where the domestic labor was going in families even more so than we ever knew before, especially for kids who didn't have broadband internet access, or did have broadband internet access, but had parents who were essential workers. And that kind of weight shifted onto them as well. We have to make it easier for families. We have to make it easier for working families. And the state has a $15 billion resource surplus this year, another $20 billion in resources coming from the federal level. We need to put that money to work, and we need to put it to work in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Ms. Fowler. And you're muted, Ms. Fowler.
I believe the question was whether or not we support universal childcare and universal pre-K. I do. Those are a part of my platform. That is a part of my candidate statement in the sample ballot that you all will have received. It is a huge disadvantage for communities across the state. Childcare, what crumbling childcare system we did have, has just been completely decimated in this pandemic. And I've seen many women have to choose between the future of their kids' education versus being able to make the decisions and stay gainfully employed or be able to run their businesses. It has set women back almost 50 years in this pandemic. So I am doubly committed to working towards universal childcare as well as universal pre-K. As it relates to our school budget, let's get some numbers here on the table. We have a number of kids being trafficked, sex trafficked. Ages 11 to 14 are being targeted. 90% of the kids being trafficked in and out of our schools are foster youth. They don't have the village that they need around them. We need some form of safety within our schools. What that looks like may be different than what we currently have, but we need to come up with a serious set of plans. I have been a former women's commissioner. I worked with Homeland Security to combat human trafficking. I have seen this throughout the city in the county of Los Angeles, helping young women and boys, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, be placed in safe houses and away from their captors. We have a lot of work to do as it relates to safety, but I assure you, the school police budget, which is less than half of probably 1% of LAUSD's budget, is not going to even begin to touch dealing with our universal child care problem or lack thereof in this state. Yes, we do have a budget surplus that we can be working with this. Oh, well, thank you for that. And thank you. That is my response.
Thank you. Mr. Morales.
Yes, I 100% support universal childcare and pre-K. One of the reasons I got into this race was because years ago, I was on the West Adams Neighborhood Council. I was the homeowners representative. And I will never, ever forget, we were having a community meeting and a young woman came to the meeting and it was her turn to speak. And she was trembling, I believe with anger, but just trembling, and there were like tears in her eyes because she was beside herself. She's a working single mother, and I guess the program where her children had childcare or pre-K, it had been cut, and she came to us with tears in her eyes, begging us to help her, begging to find a solution. And I remember thinking, okay, we're a neighborhood council. Now, y'all know we can't solve problems at that level. If you're familiar with neighborhood councils, you know, we don't have the budget. We don't have the power. We don't have the resources. And that has stuck with me all of these years. This woman was just trembling with fear and anger that she couldn't afford to go to work because the childcare was eating up her entire salary. So yes, 100% I support universal childcare and pre-K. In one of the wealthiest states, in the wealthiest state in the nation, and in the wealthiest nation the world has ever known, surely we can find the resources to take care of our children. So 100% I support, 100%, without question.
And thank you all for your responses to that. Our next section deals with environmental racism and possible solutions. For a very long time, for me, it was phrased as environmental justice. I can't remember when it was, but Mark Lopez used to be the ED of East Yard in East LA, was the first person who I actually heard call it environmental racism, which I think makes a lot more sense and it really situates the problem a lot more. But to hear more about that, we are going to hear from Bryan Ortega, also a candidate and organizer for Los Angeles City Council in 2022. Bryan.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. So climate change poses an existential threat to Los Angeles, California, and our planet overall. This crisis is fueled by environmental injustices like neighborhood oil drilling and fracking, which we know disproportionately impacts communities of color and working class neighborhoods. In 2018, the global climate science community stated that we have less than 12 years to mobilize our economy and transition to a carbon-free based society in order to address this crisis. In California, we have elected to claim to be climate leaders, but have yet to consistently demonstrate that, such as the recent failure of SB 467. Just for all the candidates, my first question is, what are your plans to address the crisis at the scale and urgency required? We can start with Ms. Fowler.
Thank you. I'm like, pick me, pick me. This is my driving force, why I do this, why I'm running. There are a number of issues impacting us as it relates to climate, but and environmental racism. Obviously, the drilling happening in and around our communities. For those that are just joining us and didn't hear my opening statement, this is my driving force. We must stop the drilling, fracking happening in and around our communities and throughout this state. I had a personal conversation with Gavin Newsom before he took office as governor, and he swore to me that if a ban on fracking bill came to his desk, he would sign it. Let's do the work to get there. I'm not taking money from fossil fuel companies. I will never allow them to get their hooks in me. I am committed to doing this work. Also, as it relates to our water, we have 300 contaminated wells throughout the state, 80 right here in our backyard. We must start the remediation on that immediately. That is why I have these conversations with our state treasurer, Fiona Ma, our lieutenant governor, Lenny Kounalakis, who are supporting my campaign because they know I am independent and I will get this done. I will fund a Green New Deal in California and bring 500,000 thriving wage jobs, more 15 to 20% higher than what the current folks who are working in fossil fuels are making. There are currently 90,000 fossil fuel jobs in California. I am proposing 500,000. That is 5 to 1 in terms of job replacement. So I am also committed to creating an agency within our state that will poach these individuals working in fossil fuels from those and bring their transferable skills over to the side of shifting our ecology. We have to begin to we have to eradicate plastics, clean our oceans, pull the plastics out of the oceans, out of the landfill, compound them, repurpose them into construction materials. This technology is happening in China, Africa, Kenya, all over the globe. We have the science, we have the technology to be doing this work now. Also, as it relates to commercial food waste, that is another thing that I will work with our municipalities.
Thank you, Ms. Fowler.
Well, you didn't want a full plan to have, this is Sunrise Movement. This is your issue. I don't know how you expect us to give you really what you need in 90 seconds. So I hope that you'll give us some more time.
Okay, I appreciate that. Next will be Mr. Morales. How would you address this crisis?
Well, I'll tell you right now, I completely support the Green New Deal. I would support tax incentives for homeowners and commercial properties to put solar panels on the rooftops. I would support legislation that has tax incentives to move towards electric vehicles. So I don't know any arguments against trying to save the planet. Nothing comes to mind. I am not soliciting or looking for fossil fuel money for this in this campaign. When you look at the Green New Deal, it will destroy some jobs. As Della said, we have 90,000 workers in the state of California in the fossil fuel industry, but we can transition those workers. So 100%, I support the Green New Deal. I would support closing down the Inglewood oil field. It's just too close to 1 million residents. So there you have it. It's about getting electric vehicles. I would support transitioning the California fleet of state vehicles to EV, tax incentives to buy EV, panels on commercial rooftops and homes. Yeah, for it. I don't know any arguments against trying to save the planet. Thank you.
And then how about you, Mr. Bryan? How will you address this crisis?
Yeah, I'm not running just on this issue. I'm running on the intersection of all of these issues. We know that it's environmental racism. It intersects with the lowest performing schools in our district, the food deserts in our district, uh, intersects with higher rent burden shares in our district, lower home ownership rates in our district, higher criminalization in our district. All of these issues are compounded. It bothers me that we started using language like environmental racism and talking about these issues when it was Black folks being pushed out of the neighborhoods and white folks moving over into Inglewood. But we need to shut down the Inglewood oil field, absolutely. And if we've got a 5-to-1 green jobs, that would be beautiful. That sounds unrealistic, or somebody would have done it already. We have to be pragmatic. I'm tired of these standards like banning, we got SB 100 in the legislature. I support it in principle. It's 100% renewable by 2045. But the reality is when somebody puts a bill up for 2045 or something you can't hold them accountable on because they're going to term out in 12 years, it means that there's steps we need to be taking right now so that we can really hold our elected officials accountable. It's why I support, or it's why I oppose AB96, which is going to take 20% of our funding away from our resource board that monitors air and methane gas. It's why I support plastics bans. It's why I support, or I'm horrified that we couldn't pass the buffer zones in the fracking bill just this cycle. We've got to build coalitions. You do this in coalitions. Not one person can come in as a champion for this issue and change the conditions in our community because there's too much opposition. You have to build it in solidarity with folks along a whole number of issues. I built coalitions before. We fought for change before, and it's why I'm supported by CLCV. It's why I'm supported by former Culver City Mayor Megan Solly Wells, R. Vasquez, and many, many others. It's because we know that environmental racism intersects with all of these other inequities in our society. And if we address them one at a time, we're going to get stonewalled every single time. But if we look at them holistically and we build those intersectional coalitions, that's how we produce lasting change.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to ask a quick follow-up question. So speaking of the Green New Deal and timelines, what is everyone's target goals for their Green New Deal, and how will you also ensure that these jobs that we're creating are union good-paying jobs, not just regular jobs? So we'll start with Bryan. Since you went last, you can go first.
Yeah.
And then Fowler and Morales.
As fast as possible. Right? That's the most honest answer I can give you. I'm not going to tell you I'm going to bring 500,000 jobs in my first term in the green economy. The goal is as fast as possible. We've got resources. We've got to direct them into building the grid infrastructure, the green infrastructure that allows folks to have that just transition to a job that pays the same rate and is union protected. We can start the oil remediation process immediately. That's even more. It takes more union jobs to shut down an oil well than it does to maintain it. That's something we need to get going right away. I've heard 5 years. I've heard 10 years. What I can promise you is it'll be a main focus of my entire time in the legislature, no matter how long that is. And only the people in the 54th will decide how long I'm there. And if I'm not effective, I won't be there very long. But this will be a center issue for me from day one.
Can you give like a specific time, just if you can like estimate?
5 years is where a lot of the scholars are saying this can be done in a very reasonable way.
Okay, thank you. And then Ms. Fowler?
It's funny what a difference a day makes. Just yesterday in a forum with New Frontier Democratic Club, Mr. Bryan placed union jobs valued before our lives. Our lives are on the line. I'm speaking again, and look, the timeline for funding the Green New Deal for me is in my first term. We will put that bill up. We will get it passed because we know that the bond performance in Europe as it relates to green bonds are overperforming. We have the market to do it, and we can do it right away. 500,000 is not a fly-by-night number. We have a number of issues as it relates to our water, our oceans, stopping the drilling, remediation, covering up gas operations that need to be closed that are seeping toxic gases. Those jobs are very real, and they can begin as soon as possible. Is not a response. I'm sorry, but they can begin within the next ramped up, probably within the next 2 to 3 years. We have to fund the process first. Doesn't work until we fund it. I have these conversations with State Treasurer Fiona Ma, who is sitting right now with a panel of 24 individuals determining what will constitute a green bond in the state of California. How we are addressing commercial food waste. that is leaving much larger emissions than our own auto emissions. Bringing subsidies for low-income communities to be able to purchase, and working communities to be able to purchase an electric vehicle, doing all of the things that we need to do along our highways, and creating equity and access to charging stations. All of that stuff can take place fairly quickly when we have the political will to do so. I'm not a one issue candidate. Unlike some of my opponents, I'm not just criminal justice reform. I'm not just the environment. I am all of those things. I have a clear background and track record of service in this community as it relates to these issues.
Okay, so thank you, Ms. Fowler. And Mr. Morales, can you also answer that same question? What is your specific timeline to address this crisis, and how we also ensure that these jobs that we're creating are good paying union jobs?
Well, Bryan, as you said in your initial question, scholars and scientists believe we have 12 years to get this right. We all know 12 years is nothing. 12 years goes by very quickly. So my timeline would be as soon as possible. If I find myself in the assembly, I will introduce legislation that, as I've said, would move our California fleet of vehicles to EV. I would support, as soon as possible, electric vehicle subsidies so we can get our gas guzzling cars off of the highways. Again, getting solar panels on our rooftops, both residential and commercial. Time is of the essence. So my timeline is of the essence. So that's where I stand in terms of timing. I mean, we're running out of time rapidly. Again, we both know 12 years goes by very quickly. And in terms of the jobs, yeah, I would totally support all of the jobs that would be created to install these electric vehicle stations, to install the panels on the rooftops, be union jobs. I've said again and again, and I think all of us on this panel support union jobs and union workers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I had for the forum.
Thank you for that, Bryan. We're going to move on to the next section. It's around basically democratizing government. There were a number of other things that I was going to say about this, but in the interest of time, I'll be brief. I'll just say I've been working with Move to Amend on the board of directors since 2012. Our amendment, the We the People Amendment, has recently been reintroduced in Congress. Our lead sponsor is Pramila Jayapal. We are really committed to bringing about a constitutional amendment that says corporations are not people and money is not free speech, and getting money out of politics altogether. But with that, I'll end my rap and we'll go to another candidate, one I'm proud to support, Fatima for Assembly. Fatima.
Thank you. I hope I'm unmuted. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'll be quick because I know we're behind schedule a little bit. Okay, so transformative policies like single-payer healthcare and a Green New Deal face major roadblocks, in large part due to the influence of candidates who have their special interest groups on speed dial when a bill is up for a vote. The pay-to-play system is very real, especially in the halls of Sacramento. As a result, the will of frontline communities and marginalized groups are often left behind. What tangible policies will you fight for in the realm of campaign finance reform, which will push our state to be more little d democratic? And Daniel, I'm not sure who's going to go first. You could go ahead and pick. I don't want the same person to go first again. So
sure. I will start with Mr. Morales.
Yeah, I agree. We have to get corporations out of our politics. It's corrupting the system, right? We see that in Washington. We see that in Sacramento. So corporations aren't people. I think most of us would agree with that. So that's where I stand on corporations being involved in our politics. Now, you did mention single-payer system. I want to address that. As I said in my opening statement, I believe healthcare is a human right. I do not support a single-payer system. I'm referring to AB 1400, Assembly Bill 1400. I do not want to lose my private health insurance So those,
Mr. Morales, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the question wasn't if you support single payer. It was how will you make our electoral process more democratic? So if you could stick to that, that would be great.
oh, you did mention healthcare. Was that just in passing?
It was just, but my question was on how you would make our process more democratic, our electoral process.
And we have another section around single payer healthcare later, so you'll be able to make your point.
Okay, well, then I've made my point. We need to get corporations out of politics, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. And then go to Mr. Bryan next.
And we need a public financing option for campaigns. The money in politics. In my campaign, we've not solicited any corporate contributions. We've not received any corporate contributions. We're not going to get any. I'm supported by Assemblymember Alex Lee and Councilmember Nithya Raman for a reason. We share this idea that it's the people that should put you in office, not just in the contributions to your campaign, but even getting on the ballot should be a process by which community signatures put you there, which is why I'm the only candidate in this race who got enough verified community signatures to waive the fee to pay for your petition to be on the ballot. The people deserve representation in the truest sense. And that gets overshadowed when corporations are allowed to dump tons of money both into a campaign and outside. We've got some candidates who are saying no law enforcement pledges, but we know law enforcement entities are likely to get involved in independent expenditures game. And so we've got to be very mindful of all the ways corporate politics happen. But in the meantime, it's these systems that are keeping progressive candidates from really being able to shine, because the work we have to do to grow the kind of base that we need to outplay someone with those institutional contributions, those relationships is very difficult. And so we've got to be inside and outside at the same time until we can get to a position of changing this. So I'm proud to stand with Alex Lee and members of the legislature who are pushing for public options, who are pushing to get corporate money out of politics. I'm there in solidarity, and I'll be there in solidarity very soon, fighting to make this the reality.
Thank you, Ms. Fowler.
Ms. Fowler.
Okay. So I think I already answered this question earlier in my previous response. I am committed to publicly financed campaigns, not an option, but no option, publicly financed campaigns, period. And because my opponent, Mr. Bryan, is an insider, he had the entire weekend to collect signatures because he knew from his former boss, Sidney Conlager, who also supported the privatization of water with SB 625, who had IE from Big Oil in her last campaign for Senate that she did not denounce, and the establishment that is supporting Isaac Bryan, who has taken corporate contributions, money from Big Oil, and all of the like. He was able to collect those signatures because he had the inside track and had the weekend to collect them. We turned in over 100 signatures of folks from this community. And yes, I did not reach the capacity, but we did pay. We did pay for a very low rate is what we had to pay as it related to that. But most of the signatures did qualify, and we were discounted as it relates to that. Now, had I had another 24 hours, I'm sure that we would have met that. So let's stop using that, because the fact of the matter was you're an insider and you were supported by the establishment, and that is why you had access to be able to get those signatures sooner.
Not at all. Every candidate had the same window. I just was running a real campaign, and we paid close attention. So
I'm going to try to shut down the back and forth this much. I do have a follow-up question, and I'd like to give you all 30 seconds to answer. It's more about just the reality of the California Assembly and the California State Senate. We have and have had progressive majorities in the Assembly and the Senate and the progressive governor for quite some time. Yet signature policies that Californians are actually in favor of, like banning fracking, like phasing out oil production, and like single-payer healthcare, frankly, which will be our next topic, still don't register. They're still held back, principally because a lot of our assembly members and a lot of our state senators, even ones we agree with, take significant contributions from those particular lobbies and other lobbies. What steps will you take to make sure that once you are elected, you remain as immune as possible from these lobbyists and really construct your policy ideas based on your own and community input? And I'm going to be a stickler about the 30 seconds. So let's go with Mr. Bryan first.
Yeah, you build your base of real people who are supporting you. You can go look at my filing. It's online. It's people who have put me on here. It's people who have raised this money. We opened our campaign within 24 hours, we had $30,000 in contributions of real organizers in this community, of real people we built with. The way you stay uncorroded by these institutions is to not play the game as soon as you get in, right? And the way not to do that is to truly come from the outside. I come from movement politics. Insider is laughable for the kid who came out of child welfare system and has been to 11 different schools and didn't even engage with the Democratic Party until after movement work put me in this position. So that's how you stay pure, is you stay rooted in the community.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Let's go to Mr. Morales.
Thank you. The future of the planet is at stake, right? When we're talking about the environment. Mr. Bryant, the questioner, said 12 years to get this right. So I have not solicited fossil fuel money. I will not accept fossil fuel money. So to your point, Daniel, it corrupts, right? So if the state is pro banning fracking, excuse me, and
you're right, please wrap up.
Okay, so I will renounce any fossil fuel money, so it doesn't corrupt my decisions. Thank you.
Ms. Fowler.
I'm getting a lot of feedback, so I hope that I'm coming in clearly. I have stated earlier, I was the first candidate in this race to take the no fossil fuel money pledge. I'm not taking money from police unions. I'm not taking money from big tobacco, big oil, privatizers. It's those who would seek to privatize our water, our education, our hospitals, and those and the like. I am committed to funding publicly financed campaigns, not as an option. In terms of lobbyists and lobbying groups, I think what we have is lobbyists. People lobby from a variety of different industries. Teachers have a lobby. The nurses have a lobby. And yes, police and other agencies and entities and industries have lobbies.
Ms. Fowler.
I'm sorry. Can you ask the question again? Because some of these responses were so off base, I couldn't remember what the exact question was.
Well, we're at time at the moment, so we need to move on.
Well,
it was really just about how once elected, you will keep yourself immune from outside pressures from money groups. But I think there will be opportunities to address that in your closing and then some of the other questions. So right now, we're going to move on to our next section, which is about single-payer healthcare. I, of course, am a very large advocate for that. Myself and I believe some other candidates and elected representatives have shared our own personal stories about interacting with the moneyed healthcare system. I myself have a number of autoimmune diseases and other conditions, about 6 total. I will just restate really quickly what I elaborated more in the campaign, my experience with the healthcare system prior to being an elected official and my experience after, night and day. And my real response to that is everyone should have what I have as an elected official. So to ask your specific questions, I'm going to invite Pilar Chavo on. She is also a candidate for Assembly next year. Pilar.
Greetings,
Hi.
Pilar.
Hello. Sorry, I'm doing a homeless outreach right now, so I'm out and about, but I'm excited to be a part of this, and I'm listening in on all your important questions and answers. And so I have worked on organizing around single payer for about a decade. And what we've seen, I think, with the pandemic is just how critical a robust public healthcare system is. We know that Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities and poor communities are the ones who have been hit hardest by the pandemic. We know that people have lost insurance because they have lost their jobs. Hotel workers, for example, 90% of them have lost their jobs. So we know that the employer-based healthcare system really is a failed system. And we know that it saves money and it saves lives. While the kind of financial argument is always used against it, the last study showed that it would save $3.2 billion a year just in the state of California. And we also know that Covered California and the ACA, while they've made important gains, have not been enough, that it's still unaffordable for a lot of people because you have to pay monthly premiums and deductibles that are, thousands and thousands of dollars before your insurance even kicks in. So I don't think people care so much about insurance. They care about keeping their provider, which you would be able to do with the many bills that have been proposed in California. And so my question is really, how are you going to, and one other thing, sorry, we know 85% of Democrats support this. This is wildly popular in the Democratic Party, largely a Democratic state. And yet we have seen bill after bill after bill not move forward, even with a Democratic majority or supermajority and governor. And we have seen, the movement grow really to support this even more, and people broadly supporting this. So how are we going to, what's your position on single payer? And if you support it, how are you going to be a champion for it? And I'll go to Mr. Bryan first.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you for that question. Right now, 7.2% of Californians remain uninsured. It's like 2 to 3 million people. Over half are undocumented, right? We know that this exacerbates fissures in society. I have 2 little brothers with special needs. One has autism and suffers from grand mal seizures. Another has cerebral palsy. My best friend and my cousin Chris was diagnosed with ALS at 29. Him and his partner, Taylor, they can't get married because if they get married, he loses his Medi-Cal benefits. Health insurance shouldn't be a privilege. Health insurance is a right. Health coverage is a right. Not just affordable care, but quality care. We do this worse than any industrialized nation in the world. California has the 10th largest economy, or the 5th largest economy in the world. LA County is the 10th. We can do this ourselves. We can get away from the federal government. We can set up a national model that can be replicated across the state, across the country. And that's what we need to do. AB 1400 is a good step in the right direction. I am for single payer. I am for supporting this. I've been endorsed by 2 of the bill's authors. And it's something that we need to push forward on. And in order to really get it done, we're going to have to build a hell of a coalition, because like many of the issues we've been fighting for decades that seem to have never moved, it's because we haven't been able to really build the groundswell that we need to put the kind of pressure on all of the levers of power in Sacramento. We need to get this done. I'm someone who's committed to doing that. I've demonstrated that before. I'm in solidarity and support all the way with single payer.
And let's go on to Ms. Fowler.
I've been a longtime fighter for single payer. I've been organizing, there's probably images of me at rallies probably since the late 90s. I have been pushing this movement. A lot of the work that is coming to fruition is because of the work of myself and many others like myself who have seen the need for us to have a single payer system. I hosted door knocks throughout this district, not just in the 54th, but in the 62nd and the 59th, in places where we just didn't have enough people who cared enough to do this work. I did door knocks to educate our community around single payer and why. Pilar, you will never have to sell me on why we need single payer. I was proud to stand with many of our nurses in our support of Senator Bernie Sanders and fight on the floor and fight for a single payer system to be put into our party's platform. California wouldn't be the first state to enact single payer, but we are not going to be the last. And that will be because of the work that I am willing to do. I am willing to go into these members' communities and make sure that they know and have their constituents reaching out to them as it relates to single payer. I am prepared to make a full-scale campaign throughout this legislature to enact single payer throughout this state. I have been a part of a number of efforts as it relates to this. I've supported every Cal Care Initiative Act, but I also supported SB 562. One of my concerns right now with AB 1400 is the lack of funding mechanism. I'm okay to pass it as is, but we need to make sure we have the right funding structures in place to make this happen. I will do everything within my power possibly to do this. Yes, I've been impacted via health issues. I've had other family members and other people have health challenges. I won't waste your time talking about that because we know that over 65% of Californians want a single payer system. So if that means if we don't get it through this time, okay, well, thank you. I'm committed. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you, Pilar, for your question. Yes, I think healthcare is a human right. I've said it repeatedly. But if you start peeling the onion of AB 1400, you'll notice that as written, it takes away the existing structure of Medicare, Medi-Cal, CHIPS, and Covered California. Okay, so yes, I've heard 65% of Californians just now support single payer. Pilar, I believe you said 85% of Californians support single payer. Yes, we all support single payer in theory. But again, when you look at the legislation as written, you speak to anyone who's on Medicare. I mean, anyone on Medicare, and ask them, would they be willing to lose their Medicare in favor of a single payer system called CalCare? The resounding answer is no. So what I propose is enhancing and expanding Covered California. Now, Pilar, you did say the premiums are too high. I agree. For many people, the premiums are too high. So why don't we expand it and enhance it, and perhaps move to a system where those who do not have employer-sponsored healthcare can buy into Covered California, means tested. So what I'm saying is, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to work with the existing framework, which is Covered California, make the premiums more affordable, bring down the deductibles, and bring down the copays. So there's my answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Mr. Morales. I was going to have a follow-up question about where you stand on AB 1400, but I think it's clear. Mr. Bryan and Ms. Fowler support AB 1400, and Mr. Morales does not. I want to really actually follow up on the other point, which I don't think was adequately answered. In the context of single payer in California, we had a bill that was vetoed by Governor Brown. We had a bill that was vetoed by Governor Schwarzenegger, and we had SB 562. What I really want to hear is what you will do differently beyond coalition building, because that happens with everything. What will you do differently to make sure that your fellow members of the Assembly and the State Senate see that this is a priority for their members? And I'm only going to give you 30 seconds. I'm sorry. But the question was asked in a different way before. And for me personally, I think we got to do a lot more. You know, like working in coalition, talking to people, like the people that I referenced before already agree with us. It's our state representatives who are not voting the way that the people do. And then, Mr. Morales, since you don't support AB 1400, I'd like to know from you specifically who you've been talking to who really loves their, Medi-Cal, and if they are aware that Medi-Cal and Medicare systems don't cover vision, hearing, and dental, and that a single payer system would, and if you think whether or not that might change their mind. Let's start with Ms. Fowler.
Okay, just point of information, SB 562 never made it to Governor Jerry Brown's desk. He was the actual governor during the time that SB 562 happened. It was really used, to be quite honest, as a tool, which I am also praying that that is not what AB 1400 is being used for. I hope it is legitimately being pushed. I have a great deal of faith in Ash Kalra, and I know that he wouldn't be behind something that would help him. But I believe there are a number of instances as it relates to 562 that members of the legislature use that to promote their campaigns. And they got people out to rally them, and they weren't committed to doing that. I have been doing this work. I am committed to doing this work not only around coalition building, but also around calling these folks out. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Fowler. Mr. Morales.
On Wednesday, I was at my grandfather's funeral. After the funeral, many of us got together at an outdoor restaurant, and I started talking about AB 1400. One of my uncles has stomach cancer. He's in a union, and he's been getting excellent care. I spoke to my mother and several other of my family members who are on Medicare. Now, Daniel, I didn't mean to mention Medi-Cal. I'm speaking about Medicare, and the people I spoke to, every single one was unwilling to give up their Medicare instead in replacing CalCare. Okay, so again, it's Medicare. The people I spoke to, they like it, and so I just wanted to clarify that.
So, of course, we've got to get colleagues on board. That's part of the coalition building, but also we need greater action-oriented research. We've got to create new framings for this issue. The same old framings and the same old data points have had us stuck for a while. We've got to rethink that, and it's something I have a particular expertise and a history in doing. And Chandra Ford at UCLA and the Center for Racism, Social Justice, and Public Health is one of those scholars who can help lead that conversation along with others in California. The research has to be done by us and for us. And to redrive this conversation, we've got to elevate the media profile of this issue. It can't just become an issue that becomes highlighted during a presidential election or just in the short-term window to raise money or to reelect an individual candidate. It's got to become a serious issue that's on the conscience of editorial boards and our media circuits all of the time. And we've got to put that kind of a pressure to oppose it, to be very publicly spotlighted by anybody who would stand in the way of that kind of progress.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bryan. So we're going to move into the final section. It is about housing. There are a lot of conflicting elements. There are some people who prioritize affordable housing. There are other very large YIMBY groups across the state who think building more densely and more housing in general helps everybody. In order to flesh out that question, we're going to go to Alfred Tu. And Alfred, in the context of responses, since we've heard from the Fowler campaign, could you go to Ms. Fowler first in the context of responses, because she might have to leave. Our intended end time was 3:30, but it looks like we're going to end at 3:40. So if other candidates can stay, we would appreciate that. Alfred, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. So nearly half of all Californians rent, and even before COVID, many people were losing their homes or having to choose between food and rent due to rising rents. And even for the middle class, it's hard to find housing near where they work because home building has not kept up with job growth, especially in wealthy parts of the state. Many housing bills were introduced this year. I'd like to know how you would vote on them. These include Assembly Bill 1199, which is a tax on the corporate landlords that own lots of single-family houses. There is Assembly Bill 854, which would reform the Ellis Act to reduce evictions by speculators. And there is Senate Bill 9, which would allow single-family lots to be divided into 2 lots, with each having up to 2 homes. And Senate Bill 10, which would give city councils the ability to rezone for up to 10 homes per lot. And on the longer term, also, do you support the repeal of Costa-Hawkins? And let's start with Dallas Fowler.
Okay, sorry, I could not hear anything that you just said. I had just switched to my phone so I could come back on here.
Okay, Dylan just put the questions in the chat. But maybe let me go over the names of the bills again, because that's not in the description. So the first one is Assembly Bill 1199, a tax on corporate landlords that owned rental houses. The second one is Assembly Bill 854, the Ellis Act reform to reduce evictions by speculators. The next one is Senate Bill 9, which would allow single-family lots to be divided in duplexes. And then Senate Bill 10, which would give city councils the ability to rezone for up to 10 homes per lot.
Okay, I still couldn't hear you all the way, and I'm not quite sure about AB 854. I have to look a little further into that. But as it relates to SB 10 in its current form, I am opposed to SB 10 because it does not mandate or it may give us a boatload of more housing, but it's not giving us affordable, low income, moderate income based housing. And I currently live in a duplex and in a single family community, which is growing to an apartment-based community. My block has been under construction for the last year and two, and it's the same developer that's going around and going upwards. But I also live in a pretty heavily tracked area, so it's not as bothersome for me. But I know for the individuals who purchase their homes who plan to be in single family based communities and didn't plan on that, I think we have a number of areas to create opportunities for more housing, of zoning in major corridors, as well as, listen, I'm committed to bringing 5,000 units of affordable housing, low income and mixed income housing to our district, as well as 1,000-bed dormitories with storage for our homeless. I didn't hear, I think you mentioned another bill I didn't hear or I haven't read. And so I can't give you an answer on 1199. I didn't hear which bill that was precisely. I'm the only candidate in this race with actual construction experience and the political will to bring affordable housing. I have funded affordable housing throughout the state of California and throughout this country, working through the Department of Treasury. I am the only candidate in this race who has the real background and the real experience to bring affordable housing and housing for our homeless. I am so sorry. I have another interview and I am not going to be able to stay on with you all. I really wish that we could talk a little more about the environment. That's what I was expecting this call to be about, but I hope that I was able to answer all of your questions. I appreciate your time and I'm so sorry, but I have another interview that I cannot be late for. I do sincerely appreciate you all putting this forum on. This was fantastic, and thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us, Ms. Fowler.
Thank you. And next, let's go to Samuel Morales.
I'm fine with AB 1199, that corporate tax, the tax on corporate landlords with 10 or more homes. That makes sense to me. We need to protect our small landlords, but 10 plus homes, no problem with that. Now, the sticky part is I'm saying one of my biggest issues is low income and affordable housing. And then we are faced with the fact that we have a bill in front of the legislature that would allow for duplexes in single family home neighborhoods. So either we want more housing or we don't. So I would propose that we build low income and affordable housing along our mass transit corridors, but in the commercial districts of those mass transit corridors. So what do I mean? I'm talking about, for instance, the Expo line. So housing along Jefferson, on the corners of Crenshaw, on the corners of La Cienega, on the corners of La Brea, on the corner on the major commercial intersections. Now I know the Expo line goes through portions of West LA and Palms, and when it's going through those neighborhoods that are all single family home residences, no, I would not support putting high density housing in those neighborhoods. So again, to be clear, if we want more housing, we need to build more housing. So we're kind of speaking out of both sides of our mouth, right? Supply and demand dictates if we have more housing, the cost will come down. So I agree with Dallas, if we're gonna be building duplexes in certain neighborhoods, they're gonna be market rate. That's not gonna help the low income and affordable housing crisis. But I think there's a way to do it along the mass transit corridors where there's a lot of commercial activity within, I think the rule of thumb is within a 7-minute walk from a station. That's about as long as people will walk. So, you know, a few blocks north, a few blocks south.
And you're at time.
Thank you. Thank you, Alfred.
Thank you. And now let's go to Isaac.
Alfred, it's good to see you. Yes, to AB 1199. The corporate tax is incredibly important. Nobody talked about the Ellis Act. We absolutely have to reform the Ellis Act with AB 854. We have this idea right now where speculators, landlords are coming in, buying property, claiming themselves to be insolvent, and then evicting everybody who lives in there, including if they're in rent-controlled units. It's a scary tactic for the folks who have had it exposed to them, and we have to reform that immediately. SB9 and SB10 are good ideas in terms of thinking about building up density. We have to create additional housing stock, but it's also important for us to remember that there are parts of our district and parts of our community that already have greater density than other parts, right? And so I would hate to see these kind of measures be used to continually densify parts of our region without others that still have the local protections in place to keep everything else out. Also, the affordability point is incredibly important. We need low income housing. We have to question what affordable housing truly means and really refigure those metrics, because right now, affordability means something drastically different than it did even just a year ago, especially when we have the eviction moratorium in place. But we know folks have been unable to pay any rent for a long, long time. And those who have been extremely rent burdened, with over 30% of their take-home pay going to their rent for a long, long time. So we have to think about this in a very intersectional and nuanced way. It's also really important for us to remember that we currently have more vacant units in Los Angeles than we do people sleeping on the streets. So it's not just a housing stock conversation. There's a lot that's going into this and a lot that we've got to bring to the legislature.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your questions, Alfred. I have a quick follow-up, and I want to let you know that we're going to go into closing statements. They're just going to be 1 minute in the interest of time, but I'd like to ask you to see if you can highlight something that you think is really important about your campaign that maybe we haven't covered today. If you've covered everything, just do a 1 minute closing statement. But my follow-up in the context of what Mr. Bryan said and what Mr. Morales said are yes or no questions. The first is, are you in favor or against getting rid of single family zoning? And the second is, are you in favor or against a vacancy tax? And these are yes and no questions. Please don't give me sentences. Mr. Morales, are you in favor of getting rid of single family zoning?
No.
Mr. Bryan. I'm sorry, Mr. Bryan, you are muted.
The answer is yes, but housing affordability is still the key question.
Okay, and then the second question, are you in favor or against a vacancy tax? I will start with Mr. Bryan first.
Oh, yes.
Mr. Morales.
I would say yes.
Okay. Once again, I'm sorry Ms. Fowler had to leave, because I think this has been a very spirited conversation, and there have been some issues that don't necessarily come up in other forums, or not in the same way they have been here. So first of all, I just want to thank all the candidates for making some time today. I know how busy a campaign can be and how stacked days are. And I want to thank all of our questioners, many of whom are candidates, for asking questions today. Before we go to the closing statements, I want to reiterate that Cerise Castle, who was on Stack first as one of our guest questioners, has a series at Knock LA about the LA Sheriff's Department and the gangs within. You can look. You can go to knock-la.com to look at all of her articles. It's an incredible series. They also have some great articles both on charter schools and LAUSD and LA school segregation. Additionally, they have articles around the amount of money that's poured into our assembly and state legislature and how that prevents progress, particularly in terms of the environment. Sometimes maybe focused on Senator Bob Hertzberg, but very good to read. They also have articles on campaign finance reform more generally, talking both about our state assembly and the LA City Council. As we mentioned before, they have in-depth articles around single-payer healthcare and, of interest to all of us in Los Angeles County because of the high price of housing, information around land speculation and the financialization of housing that's happened in a more extreme way since the 2007-2008 financial crisis. I know if you're a millennial, this is like your third or fourth crisis since you've been alive. I apologize for that as a late Gen Xer. But in the context of this race, I'd like to give you both an opportunity to make a 1 minute final statement. Please keep it to 1 minute. And really, if there's something that we didn't cover today that you'd like to highlight, please focus on that. We'll start with Mr. Morales and end with Mr. Bryan. Mr. Morales.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope this forum showed you that, all of us candidates, we're all very passionate about what we're talking about. I hope you saw that, there are many things that we agree upon in terms of education, in terms of the environment. I think the one thing, a couple of things I stand out on. I think the one that I should just come clean about is how I do not support single payer. I want to reiterate, healthcare is a human right. I support expanding covered California, lowering the premiums, lowering the out-of-pocket expenses in terms of the deductions and the copay.
15 seconds.
So, thank you very much for your time, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Daniel, for all of the crises all of us millennials have faced. I think we should hold you personally responsible. My campaign is one that came out of movement organizing. I sat on the Justice LA executive board. I've built with LA Can. I built with Black Lives Matter. I'm endorsed by the leaders of Black Lives Matter who don't often even get involved in politics. I did not come to politics for the sake of ever wanting to run for office. I came to it from fighting for change. The community put me here. It's the community who stands behind me. Politics as usual is slandering campaigns. Politics as usual is defaming candidates and their families. Politics as usual gets us stuck and gets us nowhere. I'm about building coalitions that force change. It's how we got Measure J passed November. We had Black Lives Matter and Mayor Garcetti pushing the same ballot measure. It's that kind of ability to build towards shared values that I'm going to bring to Sacramento. And I'm grateful for today's conversation. Thank you for having me. I'm incredibly honored.
Thank you. And once again, thank all of the candidates for making time for this forum. I know you didn't really have a whole lot of time to respond, so thank you for making it here today. Just want to take some time to thank the convening sponsors, Americans for Democratic Action, Southern California, Healthcare for All, Los Angeles, of course, Knock LA, which is an essential source of journalism here in the Los Angeles area. If you have not had an opportunity to read their articles, please go to knock-la.com today and read up. They keep us informed where other institutions like the LA Times falter. And also, of course, and for a lot, with the Sunrise Movement Los Angeles, who have been, a very active participant in local politics since their inception, and have been providing means through which young people of whatever age, I don't actually like the generational labels, can participate in politics. So thank all of the sponsors, thank all the candidates. Be sure to vote. You should be receiving your ballot actually this week, I believe. If you haven't already received it, and you'll be able to vote for the next 30 days. And election day, I believe, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, is May 18th.
Correct.
With that, I'll just say thank you all and have a great day.